Next will be the Nobel laureate, who is giving us what I call a goodwill address, cum, some intellectual exertions. It's more than a goodwill address. Wole Soyinka.
This conference, and I'll send the full text to the organizers in case other parts are useful. I will title this my contribution, Violence, Ethics, and the Policing Imperative. What academia is singularly equipped to contribute to a people's security is, I would suggest, the inculcation of a holistic awareness in others. By others, I refer to government and other policymakers and influencers of society, as well as the generality of the government, that is, you and me. An understanding, in other words, that a people's security depends absolutely on recognition accompanied by practice and conduct. That security is not a single-track affair. Of course, it is primarily a formal responsibility of the state. It is, however, just as crucially a participatory undertaking that involves the citizenry. Indeed, even at the risk of seeming to attempt to let the state off the hook, I believe that the people should assign about 60% of security responsibility to themselves, leaving just 40% to the state. These are, of course, rough divisions, but the implication is clear enough. In their own interest, citizens should assume the major proportion of the task of securing their own existence through structures that are community-based. The state is unlikely to accede readily to this because most states do not trust the polity, being illegitimate or having forfeited their legitimacy through misgovernance, self-alienation, and/or outright criminalities. The state becomes so preoccupied with its survival that it sees even engagements of mutual benefit to both sides as enemy tactics, an attempted erosion of its authority. Today, however, within the nation, few will deny that Nigerian humanity is rapidly joining the ranks of the endangered species. Only a minority is spared the routine of waking up in the morning and sinking almost immediately into the gloom of fear. An oppressive inability to reassure oneself and one's household that at the end of that working day, one would regain home intact in one whole piece. Within the home, the commonest expression is sleeping with one eye open. As for a road trip, virtually anywhere within national borders, the question is, are you fated to be ambushed, kidnapped, and marched into the deep forest, blindfolded, brutalized, starved, while negotiations commence over ransom for your liberty, and even life? The consequence is that the productive energies and resources are squandered, diverted to that elementary aspect of security. Survival, plain, simple, and foremost. This nation has cause to worry about more than physical survival. We find ourselves within a vortex that sucks the people under, spews us into an ethical void, where future generations are programmed to accept as normal, even laudable, what our collective inner being once considered unthinkable. State neglect and indifference promotes the language and posture of civic surrender as we careen heedlessly through blood-greased chutes towards extinction. We do where the primary responsibility lies. Unfortunately, however, the first-line victims are the least equipped in the strategies for their own survival. Very few at this conference are equipped to deal, for instance, with Boko Haram, with marauding cattle herdsmen armed with AK-47s, or with ISWAP and allies constantly expanding their domain across the West African landscape. However, grassroots police, under whatever name, can reduce the current epidemic of kidnapping, child rape, and ritual killings. That, I hope, is so obvious that it needs no reiteration. That grassroots policing is a tested measure against the dehumanizing of the weak, the exposed, and other vulnerable of society. This has been proved again and again. The average citizen is not equipped to face the armed robber. We know to whose portfolio that belongs. But civic participation is also critical, since the citizen can be enrolled in the basic exercise, for instance, of noting where there's a sudden, unexplained rush of affluence, where it inundates the community. Members of that community can be schooled into understanding that they have a responsibility to themselves to ask questions, cultivate alertness, probe, monitor, and share the unusual, refusal to be seduced by the trickle-down largesse that occasionally moistens their parched throats and renders them accessories to crimes against their own being and even survival. The synergy is thus what security deeply requires. The hurt shared when one's child is kidnapped and run through inhuman stress, often traumatized for life. Security battles with one arm tied to its side through an unyielding sense of lines of separation. By contrast, an architecture of security gradation, I beg your pardon, reduces the sense of estrangement. The bastardized slogan, "the policeman is your friend," draws a bitter guffaw from citizens, but does not cease to be a legitimate ambition of society. I have a special request on this occasion. It is one that we do not often, and for reasons that are easily identified, we do not often hear. However, if only once in a while, social conscience, complete holistic social consent, demands that it be voiced. And so, let the cloak of humaneness be extended in all its effects to those who place their lives at risk to ensure that society survives and that its members, that is, you and I, enjoy even a modicum of existence in safety and dignity. The excesses and abuse of power, wherever detected, must of course be resisted and countermanded strongly will and its part of the eternal credit of the movement, now etched as a milestone on Nigerian history. What society also owes itself, however, is a rigorous guidance of turning into the very monstrosities that it arouses and mobilizes itself to expunge. When acts of sheer sadism are tolerated as the norm, we coarsen our own human sensibilities and teach youths that all ethical barriers are banished and that all that is left is a recourse to barbarism at its rawest and crudest. I'm open to challenge from anyone on the justice, for instance, of beating a policeman to death, setting him on fire, then sharing his flesh. All this in full public glare, not attributable to state propaganda. Listen to the following open admission by two quote-unquote activists to a group of journalists in Ibadan. Ibadan, one of the most history-suffused, economically vibrant cities on the African continent, certainly among the most densely populated. Join young Abiodun, 70 years of age, and Mubarak, 24, during an interview with journalists at the police headquarters in LA in Ibadan. First, Abiodun, I quote, on Sunday, October 22, he says, Mubarak asked me to follow him to Alabata area in Ibadan, where his wife was staying. We got to Iwo Road and saw that the road had been blocked. Smoke was billowing. When we moved closer to see what was happening, we saw human beings being burnt. The mob was hitting the burnt bodies with sticks and taking the body parts. Mubarak came to me and said he wanted to take some of the body parts. He said he had someone he would sell them to. Mubarak went to take the two skulls. Now, Mr. Young Mubarak corroborated Abiodun's confession. In his words, I quote, some people in the crowd removed hands, legs, fingers, and feet, while others gathered the ashes from the burned bodies and took them away. I told Abiodun I would take. My dear colleagues, in whose cause, in whose just cause, I quote, was this abhorrence perpetrated? I personally repudiate whatever share of such a barbaric fiesta of decadence vicariously attaches to me. And I deplore all glib notions of vicarious guilt, justice, and collective settlement that go to mute voices of revolt, the dismissive waves of unconcern, the lack of response, of proportionate public horror, all of which collaborate as the end of a new and this mentoring a new generation.
Card like 2K, the other price card. Write your name, yeah. Money for your hand. Card. Better the price card. You know like that. You can come out soon. You go us.
Alienation.
It's a long time.
through the newspapers. And here I quote, "We need a radical restructuring of the security agencies, especially the police, not the sort of restructuring that focuses on building new barracks and purchasing new uniforms. No, we need reforms that police a civilian service, not a force. We need a police that refocuses on protecting citizens, their properties and liberties, not regime protection." Those are the words of Dr. Sam Amadi, chairman of NERC, in the Sunday Punch, November 20. And of course, there are various ways of muting that mentality of force and bringing it closer to civil society. The creation of second, third, or fourth spheres of security as understood by governance tiers and community policing, by student, cadet units, and civilian reserves, both military and police, serve to blunt the sharp edges of professionalized division in social constructs. Such an approach demystifies the uniform, that symbol of alienated authority that has become, one does acknowledge, mind you, unavoidable struts and braces in the scaffolding of modern society. There do exist accessible models. All the foregoing I readily concede, which is towards idealized options. But there's nothing wrong with holding them up as desirable and as ultimate social targets. Such models were operational in one or two Scandinavian countries during World War II, and states such as Israel operate their own versions of such formulation till today. Again, I remain aware that the Nigerian social actualities make such thinking seem utopian. But then, that very in extremis of a dire societal abandonment, one that approaches a state of total enemy, calls for drastic solutions. The recent anguished cry of the Sultan of Sokoto was not wrung from the alarmist throat of idle royalty. No, it should shatter all hermetic thinking that continues to pander to a nation's systemic collapse. A step-by-step proceeding cannot be faulted. At least everyone knows what has been openly bruited as state police. That paving stone is as solid as any on which to step as we attempt to scale the security board. The arguments have been objectively exhausted. Only the will to implementation remains stubbornly elusive. Perhaps this gathering will enable us to understand why. I wish you a productive exchange. Thank you.
That was vintage Professor Soyinka. If I may just say a word on what he has just shared with us, I will just simply say he tried to do an overview of security challenges nationally here and globally. and the barbaric levels extremism can get to, a situation where in the course of a crisis, some people were burned, and then some people went there trying to negotiate for body parts. And at the end of the day, and he was asking, in whose interest would this be? No matter what prompted your protest, is a good thing to add to the episode? Obviously, it's not good. And he did a capital by suggesting the need to focus policing more at the community level, at the state level. I recall that our next speaker, General Dambazo, in one of his scintillating lectures here, equally advocated the imperative of community policing. He even illustrated with the United States, where he was an Harvard fellow, that some universities even have university police. I hope I am doing a correct recollection, General.